All right, well, here we are at the start of Nehemiah. And for those of you who were here in the fall, we finished our study of Lamentations, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah. And so we are kind of fast forwarding through the exile and coming to the end. And as you may remember, Jerusalem had been destroyed by the Babylonians and Judah taken into exile, and that was around 587 BC. So we are coming to the time when Judah starts to return to Jerusalem. And so today we're doing kind of an introduction. We're not doing a lesson in our study guide, so there was nothing for you to prepare for today. We'll have some discussion questions that I've put together on some general themes in Nehemiah that we'll discuss in our small groups. So there was nothing for you to do today. Next week, we'll start on lesson 1 in the study guide, so you can prepare that for next week. So as I said, you'll remember that Jerusalem had been destroyed by the Babylonians. Some of the people of Judah did remain in Jerusalem during the exile, but generally most of the people of Judah were dispersed to surrounding countries, including Babylon, Egypt, Moab, Ammon, and Edom. And so really Judah, the people of the Israelites, were scattered among all the countries in the area. And some were pretty far flown, so to speak. You may have heard the term diaspora, which means scattering, dispersion. And the people were really scattered far and wide. And so they didn't all go to one certain place. They were not together as a people during this time. And there were several significant changes that happened during this time. And so I thought it would be helpful for us to think about what happened to the people of Israel during the time of exile. Because really 50 years has taken place since December 12th when we were last together. And so what happened to God's people during those 50 years? And you might have, if you've read about this time in the life of Israel, you might have heard 70 years. There's a lot of disagreement about how many years was the exile. And it depends on what date you start and what date you end. 70 is an important number in Israel. So a lot of people hold fast to that number 70 because it's a Jubilee number. It's an important number in Israel. But if you look to the 587 to about 538 when Nehemiah came back to rebuild the walls, that's around, it's like 49, around 50 years. So we don't get too hung up on the 70, but it's about 50 years since the last time we were studying about Judah and to where we start with Nehemiah. But what happened during this time? We don't want to just jump over those 50 years. So I thought as we kind of look at a general introduction to what we'll be studying this semester, it would be helpful for us to think about what happened during those 50 years. So there were some significant changes to the Jewish religion and the Jewish religious identity during the Babylonian exile. And some of these still affect or are still true of Judaism today, which is interesting to think about. So some of these include the fact that the current Hebrew alphabet was adopted during this period. So prior to that, there was a different kind of version of the alphabet that was used, but the current Hebrew alphabet that's used today was adopted during the Babylonian exile period. It was the last high point of biblical prophecy during this time, which ended in the person of Ezekiel. There were a couple of minor prophets, like Ezra and Nehemiah, that were during this time, but the last kind of major high prophet was Ezekiel. The final redaction, which we think of redacting as, pages of black marks that you can't read, but redaction being kind of the final editing or version of what was called the Torah book, or the Pentateuch, the first five books of the Old Testament. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy were referred to as the Pentateuch. They likely were finalized or formalized as canon during the Babylonian exile. So they took their final form during this time. And because the temple was destroyed, the people were taken away from Jerusalem, they were no longer able to make sacrifices at the temple. And Jewish law stated that sacrifice had to happen, it had to be performed at the temple. So as a result, practice of worshiping at the synagogue arose during this time. So there was a shift in practice of worship in Judaism to studying and teaching the Torah during this time. So they couldn't perform sacrifices because they did not have access to the temple. So the practice of worshiping in synagogue arose, and teaching the Torah became the focal point of their worship. There were also new leaders that emerged in the life of the Jewish people during this time. So without access to the temple, we know that the priests, the Levites, were the priests at the temple. They were out of a job. And so a new religious leader emerged, a new clergy, so to speak, and those were the rabbis. So they were the scholars and the teachers. They were spiritual leaders, and they began to compile what is known as the Talmud. And that is a series of writings that further explain the Torah. So the Torah was the law, and so they would, almost like what we know today as commentaries, only the Talmud had a more authoritative role. So they would comment on the Torah, and that would help people understand how to follow the law. And so people would take the Talmud as kind of the rules to follow the law, so to speak. So here's an example from the Talmud explaining Exodus 31, 12 to 17, which is about how to keep the Sabbath holy. And so this is an excerpt from the Talmud. It says, if the homeowner lifted an item in the private domain, extended his hand into the public domain, and placed the object into the hand of a poor person, in that case, the homeowner performed the labor of carrying out from the private domain into the public domain in its entirety. And therefore, that homeowner has violated the Sabbath because they performed work on the Sabbath. But if the poor person extended his hand into the private domain, and either the homeowner took an object from his hand and placed it into the private domain, or the homeowner placed an object into the hand of the poor person, and the poor person carried the object out into the public domain. In those cases, and the two that follow, the act of transferring the object from one domain to another was performed jointly by two people, the poor person and the homeowner, because each performed only part of the prohibited labor. Both of them are exempt. So it was very specific about how you do or do not perform labor on the Sabbath, so people could be very sure about whether or not they were violating the law. And so this became the role of the rabbi, to help the people adhere to the law. So that was one of the roles of the rabbi and the leaders as they developed this sort of commentary or elaboration on the law to help people maintain their religious holiness. Another type of leader emerged, and that was a community leader within the kind of social world of the Jews. And we've known the leaders of Judaism as kings, and also referred to as the patriarchy. This was a leadership that came known as the exarchy. So they're in exile. So a leader in exile became known as the exilarchy instead of the patriarchy. And there was a term in Aramaic called Resh Galusa, and in Hebrew became known as Rosh Galut. And this was a representative to the Babylonians, to the Babylonian authorities on behalf of the Jewish community. So this became like a Jewish ruler or overseer or representative. It was not a king, but these Rosh Galut representatives were a direct descendant of the house of King David, which is interesting. So they had noble status, but they were not recognized as kings. But it's interesting, that line of David, because if you recall, the Messiah was to come from the line of David, so that there was a maintaining of a recognized line of the house of David, even in exile, was an important element of God's people. And then later, another community leader that became known was called the Nasi, or Nasai. And this developed into what we know as the Sanhedrin. And this was sort of the president of the Jewish Supreme Court. So this became sort of a more authoritative ruler in a more legal sense in the Jewish community. And records of these two positions that sort of were established during the exile and then into what we know as the time of Jesus and in more modern times, records of these two positions continued even until the 10th century. So even way past when even Jesus lived, into more modern time. So as an aside, I found this fascinating as I was studying this, and it is sort of an aside because it doesn't relate to Nehemiah necessarily, but it is related to this time of exile and even more into modern Judaism. Reference to these leaders still comes up in commentaries in modern Jewish scholarship. And they come up with regard to references to the Messiah and anticipating the Messiah. And there's a series of essays on the rabbinic period in Jewish history by a Rabbi Yehuda Sherpin of Chabad Lubavitch. And he quotes a portion of the Talmud, and the reference is Sanhedrin 38a. And it's about the end of the exilarchy and the coming of Mashiach, which is Messiah. And he says, the son of David, Mashiach, will not come until two patriarchal houses are destroyed from Israel. So he's talking about the Rosh Galut and the Nasi, the Sanhedrin. And they are the head of the exile in Babylonia, the Rosh Galut, and the Nasi in Eretz Yisrael, in Israel. And it is stated in reference to Mashiach, Messiah. And he shall be for a sanctuary, but for a stone of stumbling and for a rock of offense to both the houses of Israel. So that sounds a lot like Romans 9:33, which is quoting Isaiah 14, where it says, I lay in Zion a stone that causes people to stumble and a rock that makes them fall. Rabbi Sherpin says the commentaries explain that the Jewish people in general and the house of David in particular is compared to a lunar cycle, which waxes and wanes. In order for the moon to have a complete rebirth, it must first be completely hidden. It is only then that it can finally burst forth, be reborn with a new light. So too will Mashiach, a descendant from King David, burst forth with new light of redemption. May it be speedily in our days. And then in a companion article on the importance of Mashiach, it states, why is the coming of Mashiach so central to the Jewish system, Jewish belief system? Because the Torah teaches us that there is purpose to our world. And the Messianic era is the actualization of that idea. From the dawn of time, God envisioned for himself a dwelling place right here on planet Earth. And he puts us here to fashion this home, to transform darkness into light. And soon that day will come when God's glory will be revealed in this nether realm, and we will enjoy the fruits of our millennia-long work, the end product of our labor of love. So it's interesting that there's a recognition that God's light will be revealed, but there's a sense that it's because of something that we do, which is very different than our understanding of the reason that God's light comes into the world. And then it goes on to say, the belief in Mashiach has sustained our nation throughout a 2,000-year exile, fraught with expulsions and persecutions, our ancestors' firm belief in a better time to come, and their trust that they would be resurrected to witness that day. And today, finally, we stand at the threshold of redemption. There's still a longing for Messiah. But then he concludes with this: one more good deed by one more person may be all that's needed to seal the deal. It's like, you're there, and you missed. It's an interesting perspective, and that's a modern scholar, modern Jewish scholar. We could do a whole lesson on why Judaism doesn't recognize Jesus as Messiah, even when we both read scriptures like Isaiah 8 as messianic texts. But I mention this because even in modern day Jewish scholarship, the experience of Judah in the Babylonian exile is included as an important historical reference. And that's where we are in our study. So looking at what happened during the exile and some of the important things that kind of developed in the life of Judaism's religious identity during those 50 years, let's now look at the context for our study of Nehemiah. So it shouldn't surprise you that I'm going to point you to the Bible Project's overview video of Ezra and Nehemiah. And I will send the link to that in an email and also post it on the website with the video recording of today's lecture. It's a lot. It's a lot if you've looked at it. I thought about showing it, but it's just a lot. So you'll need to look at it and kind of absorb it. But I'm going to pull a few kind of big picture highlights from it just to give you an overview of the full scope of both Ezra and Nehemiah. We thought about doing both of the books in the study, but it became a little too much for the time frame that we have in the spring, so we decided to focus just on Nehemiah. But Ezra and Nehemiah were originally a single work written by one author. Ezra and Nehemiah both had contributions to these books, but they weren't the primary authors of the books. There was a single author with contributions by Ezra and Nehemiah, and that one primary author is unknown. So there are sections of the two books that are in the first person. So we know Ezra had a portion that he wrote, Nehemiah had a portion that he wrote, but someone else kind of put it all together. And they were originally one work. So these events take place, as I said, approximately 50 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. So from when we finished our study of Zephaniah in the fall, 50 years has passed. And Ezra and Nehemiah together is like a play in 3 acts. And our study of Nehemiah is Act 3. So we're kind of in the 3rd act of that progression. And that's why the overview video of the Bible Project is helpful, because it will take you through all 3 acts and you'll see where Nehemiah fits in the scope of all 3 of those. So the return of Judah from exile takes place under three key leaders in three phases of return to rebuild Jerusalem. So you might remember in that map or the timeline that I gave you, and Jill has hers because she says she's been using it. You want to hold it up and so you'll see at the far right, there are those two little lines that kind of go down. So there actually should be three lines on there because there were three phases of return to Jerusalem. The first one was under the leader Zerubbabel, and he returned. So Zerubbabel's not on that timeline because there's not a book of Zerubbabel in the Bible. But he's in the book of Ezra, he's covered in there. And he came back, and his role was to rebuild the temple. And so you read about him coming with some of the exiles, and that was his task, was to come back and rebuild the temple. Ezra came back, and his role was to teach and rebuild the community of Judah in Jerusalem. And then Nehemiah's task was to come back and rebuild the city walls. And so that's what we'll be studying, is Nehemiah's return and his work to kind of get the people together and to rebuild the walls around the city of Jerusalem. And each of these three stories is told kind of in parallel format. And there are three parts to each story. So each of these leaders, when they come to Jerusalem, or they're sent by a Persian king, the king is moved by God to send the leader back to Jerusalem. And then the leader returns with a group of exiles and faces opposition by people who are present in Jerusalem, and they overcome that opposition, and then they work on their task. And then the ending, you would think, would end in some victorious, result, and everyone would be happily ever after. Well, it doesn't quite work out that way. There's some kind of strange anticlimax to each leader's story that leaves us sort of like, well, okay. Okay. And we've seen this before. We've seen it in our study last fall with Lamentations and Habakkuk and Zephaniah. There was sort of this sort of letdown at the end, like, well, where's the happy ending? And we don't get that here either. And that, I think there's a reason for that. So we see this cycle happen with all three of these leaders. The king sends them, the leader faces opposition and overcomes it, and then there's this sort of letdown at the end of the story. And I think, and this is what the Bible Project points out, is that it points to the need for something more. And that's the story of God's redemptive process. That God's people, they're trying, but there needs to be something more. There needs to be a whole redemption of heart by God's people. And that's coming in Jesus. And so we never see them completely get where they need to be, because there needs to be a new covenant. There needs to be a new heart that only God can bring to them. And this is an ever recurring theme in the Old Testament. They need to have a whole transformation if they're going to be able to fully love and serve God. And it's coming. We know it's coming. And so we can accept that anticlimax because we know that it's coming. So for Nehemiah specifically, now that we kind of see that he's Act 3 of this kind of bigger picture of return from exile. Just as when we started our study of Lamentations and Habakkuk and Zephaniah, we needed to think about how we read those books as biblical poetry. Remember, we talked about the genre of biblical poetry and how we read it to understand. We also need to think about Nehemiah and the genre, or I should say genres, of how Nehemiah is written so that we can understand it most clearly. And so drawing from a really helpful introductory course that I found online through the Gospel Coalition, I want to mention just two different types of genres that you find in Nehemiah. One is narrative, and the other is documentary. And so I think it's helpful to just keep these two things in mind as you read Nehemiah, because otherwise you can be like, what is this like list dropped here in the middle of the story? So the narrative portions of Nehemiah are different types of stories, essentially. There's a general's diary, like accounting for like his tasks as a leader. Governor's report, he essentially functioned as a governor. Management handbook, like how he handled the people and how he helped them get the task done. And then a memoir, kind of his life, what he was doing. Even at the end of chapter 1, it ends with a very simple statement: I was cupbearer to the king. So it's got those elements of like the different aspects of his life and how he's kind of capturing those elements of his story. So in these narrative sections, we get the story of the rebuilding of the wall, which is really a conflict story. It's got some suspense, it's got some heroism, and then there's a covenant renewal narrative. And that is actually one of the grand dramas that we read in the Bible. It's a wonderful story. And then we see Nehemiah as a hero figure in these narratives. So you see these stories and you kind of get a real sense of who this leader was for the people of Judah. But mixed in with these are these documentary lists and materials, inventories, genealogies, lists, and it kind of interrupts the flow of the narrative. So it shows the author has kind of this historical impulse. He wants to record things that to show that there was like, it almost like to legitimize, like there were real numbers associated with this process, and there were people and there was stuff and there was, it was real. What they were doing mattered. And so you sort of need to step outside of the narrative to take in kind of this historical documentary material. And so I just want to mention that, because if you don't kind of separate those two in your thinking as you read through, you can get kind of muddled. The story can get a little muddled and you're kind of like, you know what I mean? Like you get sort of distracted by the documentary. And it's not that those lists and the genealogy stuff isn't important. Sometimes when I hit a genealogy or a list like that, I tend to kind of like, okay, skip over and get to the next full sentence. But I would encourage you to kind of just take your time and kind of read through them. And sometimes there's something in one of those lists or a genealogy that makes you kind of go, I didn't realize they did that, or that was part of this. And so I just encourage you to still rest on it, but understand that there are two different kind of purposes to these different genres represented here. And then finally, I just want to touch on the different themes of Nehemiah. And this is where we'll spend some time in our small groups talking about how these themes kind of have touched us already as we kind of come to this study. And we'll kind of unpack these more as we look at the text and then think about these in our own life as we use the study guide. So various themes of Nehemiah. In chapter 1, we encounter the theme that the Lord hears prayer. There's a beautiful prayer of Nehemiah in chapter 1. Secondly, the Lord works providentially, and you'll have these. You don't have to try to capture these. You'll have them on a paper written out. In Nehemiah 2, we have the theme that the Lord works providentially, especially through powerful rulers, to bring about his greater purposes. So you'll see Nehemiah going to the king and saying, you know, I would like to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the wall. And the king giving him what he needs to do that, that maybe he wouldn't have been able to otherwise. In Nehemiah 4, we have the theme that the Lord protects his people. So therefore they don't need to be afraid. And there's a time where they're rebuilding the wall, but they're being attacked. And so they need to kind of build the wall and defend themselves at the same time. And there's an image of kind of a shovel in one hand and a sword in the other. They're doing, or people standing guard over those who are doing the work. And so somehow they're able to do what they need to while they're still kind of being under attack. In Nehemiah chapter 9, we see the theme that the Lord is merciful and faithful to his promises, despite his people's persistence in sin. We haven't heard that before, have we? His people's persistence in sin is probably the theme of the entire Old Testament and beyond, right? Even today. In Nehemiah 10, we see the theme of worship at the center of the life of God's people. That's that covenant renewal narrative. It includes the willing, joyful giving of resources. There's a section where Israel says, or Judah says, we will do this, we'll do this, we'll give this, we'll give this. They bring, it's like they bring everything they have to God. And then lastly, God's people need to be on guard against their own moral weakness. And this is part of the anticlimax. They go through all of this, these amazing, you know, building the wall and this covenant renewal. And then at the end, Nehemiah walks around and he sees more of the same failure and weakness. And he ends up just by saying, God, would you just remember that I tried to do good? And that's the end. So he ends up seeing the weakness of the people and saying, you know, God, remember that I really tried. And so we also need to kind of be on guard, because even though we can have the high highs, we can still kind of succumb to our moral weaknesses, regardless or in spite of our best intentions. So I think, you know, keeping perspective on kind of where Judah is coming from, coming out of the exile, what the kind of purpose of Nehemiah is in bringing people back to kind of complete this return from exile and this rebuilding of Jerusalem, and the growth that has occurred during the exile. It's not like Judah was taken away and they just sat in prison for 50 years. They were growing as a people. They were developing as a people of faith, and they were developing in their religious identity as God's people. And so and then time comes, you know, it's about 400 years later, Jesus comes, and they're a thriving people at that time. And so they continue to thrive and develop, and Jerusalem is rebuilt, and the story continues. So this is where we kind of re-enter the story, and I'm excited for this because we made it through our study of of Lamentations, and I think this is an exciting kind of perspective on everything they went through and what God is bringing them to next. And I think I wouldn't call it the happy ending, because it isn't. It's the next step in God's story of redemption. And the benefit that we have is that we know the kind of happy ending or the next happy section of the story when Jesus comes. And so we see where it's all headed. And so I'm excited for this next chapter that we'll be studying together. So let's pray. Lord, I thank you that we have Nehemiah and Zerubbabel and Ezra to instruct us about your plan of redemption for your people. We thank you that we can learn from them, and we just pray that as we go into our groups now, that you will help us to think about the big picture of these leaders and this chapter in the life of your people as we anticipate diving deeper into your word together in the days ahead. In Jesus' name, amen.